Hello, everyone. Hopefully, you can hear me. I am recording ahead of time, unfortunately, because I will be traveling again, God willing, on the West Coast. This is the daf for Shabbos, Parshas Para, uh, daf Nun Hey 55 in Masechet Menachot. I'm not really sure where to start because it's really the middle of a sugya, but I'm going to start in the middle, and hopefully, David will catch up to where we're up to. So I'm going to start at the second line of Daf Nun Hey. I'm going to start from the bottom of the Dun Bet. Sorry. So I'm going to do a few review. Hopefully, for everyone, this will be a little bit of a review. So I'm going to start from Lihachi. So 10 lines from the bottom. Again, I hope this will be a review because it's really in the middle of the sugya. And if you recall, what we're discussing is this question about if you have a food, in this case, a date, that gets dried out, becomes a dried out date. It's not plump and juicy, but it is very safe, right? You can store it for a long time. Can you use it for truma and maaser for dates or figs that are, or any fruit, right, that is fresh. Okay. Sorry, we're talking about figs. So we said our first answer before was that the reason you're allowed to take the new figs, the moist figs for the dried figs is because you can give ba'ayin yafeh. You can be generous. So ask the Gemara, I'm going to start from there. So I'm starting from 9 lines from the bottom of Nandal Mabet. Ihachti, if it's true that the reason you can use the figs, the fresh figs, to take off for the dried figs is because you're giving ba'ayin yafa. What about seifa, ema seifa? What about the second case in the Braita, where, now I'm reading the Gemara, Amar Rebbe Lazar Rebbe Yossi, Rebbe Lazar Rebbe Yossi testified, Abba, my father, Rebbe Yossi, hayanotel eser grogrot miksoa. He would take 10 grogrot, and these grogrot are dried figs, remember, they're in the miksoa, which is the dryer, al tishim shibakalkala, in place of 90 figs that are sitting in the basket. They were just plucked off the tree, and they're fresh. Now, iba truma gedola, if you're talking about truma gedola, what do you mean 10 out of 100? Truma Gedola is not 10%, right? Truma Gedola is whatever you want. So some people take 1/50th, 1/40th, but not 10%. Truma Gedola Eser Mayavidite. Why is he taking 10 if you're talking about Truma Gedola? Which makes us think you're talking about Maaser. And if it's Maaser, you can't be Marbeb and Masrot. You can't take too much. Ella says Gemara, it's somewhere in between. It's Hacha b'Trumat Maaser Askina. We're talking about Trumat Maaser. Remember that the order was that the fruit that comes out is Tevel. You take off a small portion for Truma that goes to the Kohen. You take off Maaser that go 10% that goes to the Levi. The Levi has to take off Trumat Maaser. And the Trumat Maaser of the Levi is 10%, not like the Truma of Yisrael. And it's Abba Elazar ben Gomel who, it's referring to Abba Elazar ben Gomel. Titania Abba Elazar ben Gomel Omer, from the Pasuk, it says, V'nechshav lechem trumatchem. It will count for you as your truma, which is plural. Why does it say trumatchem? Why does it say nechshav lechem truma? Bishtei trumot hakatuv medaber, because the Torah is actually referring to two types of truma in this pasuk. One that's the typical truma, achat truma gedola, regular truma that goes to the Kohen and is 2% or 1/50th or a little bit more, a little bit less. V'achat trumat maaser, and the other is referring to the other truma that the Levi takes from the maaser that you give to them. And what the pasuk is teaching you is that they're similar. Kashem shetruma gedola nitelet ba'omer b'machshava, just like truma gedola you take by estimating. You don't have to have an exact number, unlike maaser. And it's by machshava. You don't even have to do an act. You could just think, I want that grain to be truma. That's enough. You can eat the rest. Kach trumat maaser nitelet ba'omer b'machshava. And I'll turn to the top of daf Nun Hey Amud Aleph, today's daf. So too, Trumat Maaser, although it's 10%, it's not exactly 10%, and it can be done with thought. And now, for our purposes, Ma Truma Gedola Ba'ayin Yafeh. Just like Truma Gedola, you can be more generous. When Torah says take a portion, Torah doesn't really say how much to take. You can give generous amount, meaning more, to the Kohen, Af Trumat Maaser Ba'ayin Yafeh. So too, Trumat Maaser, you can take Ba'ayin Yafeh. And that's why when you're taking Trumat Maaser, it's easy to say that you're allowed to take fresh fruit, fresh figs in this case, for dried ones, even though fresh ones are more valuable. And for maaser, we don't want you to take extra. For truma gedola and one thing, and trumat maaser, we're okay with you taking extra. That's called ayin yafeh. And now says the Gemara, which is why I did that whole background, because otherwise it's hard to read the next words. Umina. Now we can prove from the same Braita the answer to our question as to whether you look at a food for truma or masa or something else like it was originally, which is moist, or like it is now, which is dried, or vice versa. But you can prove from here, Amar Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Yossi, right? We're quoting now the second part of the Braita, which says that Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Yossi said, Abba haya notel eser grogrot b'miksal tishim kalkala. My father used to take 10 figs that were dried for 90 figs that were moist, which is lower quality, right? It's dried. So if you say that you view things the way they used to be, so shapir, then it's fine because dried figs used to be fresh figs. They became dried, and therefore you treat them like they are fresh, and therefore you're allowed to take 10 dried figs for 90 fresh figs. If you say you look at it the way it is now, and the way it is now is dried, batzerlo, it's too few, right? Because dried figs are not as, there's different ways to look at this, either by number or by weight, but it's just not as good quality. No one wants dried figs. They're not as many as the regular figs. So that was the question. You could prove from here that you look at the original state and answers the Gemara Kiata Rav Dimi Amar Rebbe Elazar, and Rav Dimi came, where the sixth line of Daf Nun Hey Amud Aleph, Rav Dimi came and said in the name of Rebbe Elazar, that's not a proof, because grogrot are different. Shani grogrot, figs are different. Other fruits, you have dried grapes, that's what we call raisins, or other dried things, or other things that the meat we had yesterday that gets smaller when it dries out. That could be very different. Maybe you do look at the current state. But by figs, you look at the original state because figs, figs can be converted back to their original state. You can boil them, I guess, in water, and hachsiran kemochein, you can make them fresh figs. So, again, I don't eat a lot of figs, and I don't know if this is how true this is, but figs are different than other dried fruits because they can actually be restored to their original state, and therefore, figs always, even if they're dried, can be used for truma and maaser on fresh figs, but that may not be true about other things. Tana Rabbanan. Now let's discuss this a little bit further from the following Braita. Okay, we're at Tana Rabbanan, 8 lines from the top of Nun Hey Amud Aleph. Says the Braita, it's a quote, Tarmim te'inim al hagrogrot. You can take truma from te'inim. Remember, te'inim are now fresh figs, so they just came off the tree. They're juicy, they're plump, they're moist. And grogrot are dried figs, right? Which is what we eat a lot in America, I guess, or we used to eat. So you can take truma from fresh figs for dried figs, right? Let's say you harvested 100 dry figs, or 90, let's say. They're sitting on your roof, and you want to eat them. You have 10 fresh figs. You say, I'll give these to the, well, 2, I guess it would be 2 to 10, or 10 for Levi, right? I'll give these 10 to the Levi. Says the Braita, you can do te'inim al hagrogrot bimakom shiragilim lasot te'inim grogrot. Only in a place where they are ragil, where it's typical, it's common practice to take your figs and dry them out, right? So you're allowed to do it in that case, but you're not allowed to do lo grogrot al te'inim. You're never allowed to use grogrot, to use dried figs, as your truma or your maaser for te'inim because it's inferior quality, and afilu b'makom sheragilim lasot te'inim grogrot, even in a place where they typically make the te'inim to grogrot. So you might say, who cares? I'll separate these grogrot, I'll give them to the kohen. They're not as good as the te'inim, but we're going to turn the te'inim into grogrot anyway, so it's not a big deal. Now, the issue here, which we're about to get to in a second, is a more complicated issue. Obviously, we want you to take the better fruit. But we recognize that, as everyone knows, grapes or dates that are not dried, or figs, they get ruined, right? So let's say there's no kohen, or the kohen can't eat them all. So you walk up to the kohen and say, here's 1,000 grapes. This is my truma to you. And the kohen's like, what am I going to do with 1,000 grapes? They're good. I'll eat 20 of them. The rest are going to go bad. Maybe the kohen would prefer to have dried grapes or raisins, or prefer to have dried figs, because it will last longer. So do you get the better one or the more long-lasting one? So that is a question that comes up a lot in Trumot, and that's what this Breita seems to be addressing. So let's unpack or analyze the Breita. Amar Mar, says the Gemara now. Let's read the Breita. Where am I? Somewhere. The first word on the line, around 12 or 14 lines down. Quoting the Breita now, the Breita said, Tormim te'inim al hagrogrot. You're allowed to use te'inim as your truma, right? As your truma or maser, for te'inim are fresh, for dried ones, bimakom shuragil maso te'inim grogrot. If it's a place where they always turn the te'inim into grogrot anyways. Says the Breita, says the Gemara, that implies only bimakom shuragilim in. If this place, they turn their fresh dates, fresh figs, they keep saying dates, fresh figs into dried figs, then you can treat the fresh figs essentially like dried figs, and you can take truma from them. But b'makom she'em negilim, lo. But it sounds like in a place where they are not commonly do that, most people eat their figs fresh, you're not allowed to take fresh figs for dried figs. Now, yechidami. I don't understand. Is there a kohen or not? Idi ika kohen, right? If there's a kohen there waiting to get your figs from you, then why are you allowed to take fresh figs on dried figs, right? Makom she'eino ragil amai lo, all right. Sorry, why are you allowed to take dried ones for fresh ones, right? Sorry, the opposite. I take it back. If it said you're allowed to take fresh ones, teinim for grogrot. So if you're talking about a case where there's a kohen there, why can't you do it even in makom she'eino ragil? All right, let's say it's a place where they don't turn their fresh figs into dried figs. But so what? You're allowed to give a kohen something better. Amai lo. Hatznan, we learned in the Mishnah in Trumot, makom sheyesh kohen torim min hayafeh. In a place where the kohen is there, give him the better thing, right? So you have some dates, some dried dates, give him the better one. Sorry, some figs, some dried figs, give him the better one. Ela pshita, it must be that obviously we're talking about a case, the leka kohen, right? There's no kohen. And basically what we're saying to you is that as long as they are able, there's no kohen there, right? So you're allowed to give higher quality, the fresh ones, for the dried ones. But even though there's no kohen, now why is that even though there's no kohen? Because basically you're going to separate aside your fresh figs, but everybody turns their figs into dried figs. So you're going to take these fresh figs, you're going to dry them out, and when a kohen shows up in a month, you'll give him the dried figs. But if you're not going to turn your fresh figs into dried figs, don't make them truma, because you'll put them aside and the kohen shows up in a month and they'll be full of mold. Right? So only do it in a place where you're going to turn your fresh figs into dried figs. So that's the ratio. That's when there's no kohen, it makes a lot of sense. But then ema seifa. But if you're talking about a situation where there's no kohen, the second part of the Breita said, lo grogrot al teinim. You're not allowed to separate grogrot, dried figs, for moist figs. And even b'makom shragil asoteinim grogrot, even in a place where they turn all the fresh ones into dried ones. Says Gemara, but if that's the case, idaleka kohen, if there's no kohen, amai lo, why can't you take aside dried figs and put them aside in storage so that when a kohen shows up, you'll give it to him? Hatznan, the Mishnah specifically said to do that. Makom she'ein kohen, this is the Mishnah again in Trumot, in a place where no kohen is present, torei min hamitkayim. Take truma from that which will last longer because you need it to last till the kohen comes back. So why can't you take the dried figs for the moist figs if there's no kohen? El pshita diga kohen. It must be that in the seifa, we're talking about a case where there is a kohen, and we're saying since there's a kohen, give him the fresh ones, don't give him the dried ones. So you've just set up a contradiction. Reisha deleka kohen. The reisha only worked when there's no kohen, because that's why you're allowed to take dried ones for fresh ones because there's no kohen anyways, and you're going to dry it out. And seifa diga kohen. And the seifa now is where there is a kohen. So how do you, this is really a Breita where one case is no kohen, one case there is a kohen? That's where you're in. Sure, that happens. You know, the Tana is trying to teach you two different things, and they think you're very smart. You're going to learn the Gemara, and you're going to unpack it and understand that Reisha deleka kohen, Seifa dika kohen. So in the Reisha, there is no kohen. There is a kohen, sorry. And that's why you can take, the Reisha, there is no kohen. So that's why you can take the dried figs for the moist ones because you're not giving it to the kohen now anyways. You're going to put it aside, and it's a place where they turn all of the moist ones into dried ones, right? So therefore, you can do what I said the opposite. You can take fresh, moist figs and take truma for dried ones because you're going to just dry out the fresh ones and put them aside for a kohen. But if it's a place where there's no kohen, right, and it's a place where they don't turn the fresh figs into dried figs, don't take them. Because if you put them aside, put them in the drawer, the Kohen will show up and they'll be ruined. So the Reisha is where there's no Kohen, and the Seifa, which said, don't take the dried ones for the moist ones, because it's Ayin Ra, that is the Ika Kohen, where there is a Kohen. So the Bright is really confusing, but that's how you have to read it. Says Rav Papa, that's a very nice explanation of the Braita, and I'll accept it. But I could have come up with a much more logical explanation, which is that maybe it's a machloket Tanaim. Maybe the Reisha is one Tana who says always prioritize the better thing, and the Seifa is another Tana which says always prioritize the more reliable thing, the thing that will stand. Says Rav Papa, you know what you see from here? We don't like to have two people in a Mishnah, in a Braita. We'd rather take a Braita and say it's talking about two different cases than turn it into two different people. So let's read those words. It's a very interesting principle. Says Rav Papa, Shmamina, you see from this discussion that we just had, Dachkinan umukmina matnitim betrei tami. We'd rather be dochik. We'd rather force it. And with difficulty, make a Braita explained in two different ta'amim, meaning two different cases, so that the beginning of the case is one is where the Kohen's not there. The second is where the Kohen is there. V'lo makmina betray tanai, but not say it's two different people. So we always prefer to say it's one person and two different cases than to say it's two different people. So very interesting principle, and that's what Rav Papa says you see from this Gemara. Okay, we're now up to the first of the wide lines, fifth line from the bottom, first wide line on Daf Nun Hey Amud Aleph, and we have a new Mishnah that gets us back to Menachot, right? So we talked earlier this week about Menachot and Chametz, right? Some Menachot have Chametz. Most Menachot are not Chametz. It says the Mishnah, Kol Menachot niloshot beposhrim. Unlike with matzah, I don't know how many people bake matzah, we use cold water for matzah because we're afraid that if you use hot water, it'll heat it up and make the fermentation process and chametz happen faster. So we bedafka use cold water, but kneading with cold water is not as good as kneading with warm water. So says the Mishnah, we want you to have the best water. All menachot are niloshot, are kneaded with poshrim, with warm water. Poshrim is, not hot, obviously, but not cold. But mishamram shloyach mitzvah, right? You better be careful that they don't become chametz, because except for the few that we mentioned already, you're not allowed to have chametz in your mincha. So you have to do it very fast, like we do with our matzah. Vim hechmitzu shiareh. Now, if not only the mincha, remember you have a mincha, you take out a kometz, right? You cook that, you bake it, you put it on the mizbeach, but you have shirayim, the leftover flour, and you eat it. The Kohen usually eats it. You're not allowed to make it into chametz. And if you do, over belotase, even the shirayim, if you make it into chametz, you're over in a lotase, shenemar, because the pasuk says, Kol ha-mincha shetakriva la'Hashem, lo te'aseh chametz. Every mincha, we'll see in the Gemara how we know this, lo te'aseh chametz, don't turn it into chametz. And says our Mishnah, not only can you not make it become chametz by mixing it, which is the step of, what's it called? Alisha, but you're chayiv al lishata, you're chayiv for kneading it, for mixing it, the al arichata, and for shaping it, if you turn it into chametz when you shape it, al afiata, and for baking it, if you turn it into chametz during that step. So you're chayiv for each step if you have chametz at that point. Says the Gemara, Menani Mili. Now, how in the world do you know that? No, the question here is not how do you know you're not allowed chametz. The pasuk says it. It's how do you know that the shirayim also cannot become chametz, right? Because maybe you can have chametz in the Beit HaMikdash, but you take home the flour, you don't have home, but you take it back to your room, maybe it can become chametz. You can make a beautiful challah. How do you know you're not allowed to do that? Amar Rish Lakish says, Rish Lakish, the way you know, the Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Lo te'afeh chametz chelkam. You can't make chametz your portion. Afilu chelkam lo te'afeh chametz. Even your portion cannot be chametz. So that even the portion you go home with. So is that really the purpose of that pasuk? Is that really what the pasuk is for? We need it for the fine Braita. Braita says lo te'afeh chametz. It says don't bake your mincha as chametz. Matam alomer, says the Braita. Turn to Daf Nun Hey Amud Bet, which I'm going to do. I can figure out how to do that online. 1 second. Daf Nun Hey Amud Bet. There we go. Top line. Matam alomer. What does it mean when it says in the pasuk lo te'afeh chametz? Halok Farnemer, it already said lo te'aseh chametz. It already said, it's earlier in Parshat Vayikra, it said don't make the mincha into chametz. So why does it repeat it? It said, don't make your mincha chametz. I would have thought, lo yehechayev ela achat al kulam. You're only chayev for one thing. If you make the mincha, remember there are many steps. You can knead it, you can shape it, you can bake it. You're only chayev once if you make it into chametz. Talmud lo te'afeh. Therefore, it says don't bake it into chametz. Tell you that baking it itself is a prohibition, right? Now, afiyah bechlalaita. Afiyah was included in the general principle of the mincha. Lama yatsata. Why did we explicitly say don't bake it as chametz? Hakishala, to make a hekesh to afiyah. I tell you, ma afiyah miyuchedet shehu ma'aseh yichidi. Fiyah is unique because it is singular. What does that meaning? It's its own action. You can define, there's a huge debate on what makes something define, but you can say, I'm going to bake, right? I'm going to do this part of it. Obviously, the step of turning a mincha into bread or into challah, into lechem, is one big thing, but you can identify each part of the process. Afiyah is one step in the process. And the pasuk says, don't make it chametz, chayev aleh b'fnei atzma. I also include lisha, the kneading, and aricha, the shaping it, right, putting it together, that you're also chayiv if you make it chametz during that time, or if it's chametz when you're doing that. It says the Gemara, and not only that, it's not just those actions. Even every other act that's involved, what are we including there? We already did kneading it and shaping it and baking it. Lasuya kituf. There's a process called kituf, which is a process of smoothing the dough with water. They would like shape it and they would maybe like we put egg on top of our thing. I think that's similar. So kituf is that also shumasei yichidi. That is a full action, a singular action. Chayavin aleh b'fnei atzma, and you are chayav if it's chametz or if you make it chametz for that act, right? So says Gemara, that's of course what we said in the end of our Mishnah, which is that each act in the baking and in the preparation, you're chayav for chametz, but you're using the pasuk to tell you those maaseh yichidi, and on Amud Aleph we use the pasuk to tell you that the shirayim are pasul. So which one is it for? Answers the Gemara, anan michalkam kamrinan. We're not using it from the lote afeh, right? We're using it from the word chalkam, right? It says their portion, and their portion is there to tell you even the shirayim. Says, well, okay, that's fine, but maybe that's all the pasuk's telling you. All the pasuk is telling you is that the shirayim shouldn't be chametz. How do you know that every step in the process is chayiv separately? Because in Cain, if the Torah was only there to tell you of chalkam, lichtov, it should have said chalkam lo te'afeh chametz, right? Don't make their portion, don't bake it as chametz. Why does it say the opposite? My lo te'afeh chametz chalkam, which if you read the pasuk sounds a little clunky, right? Why does it say don't bake chametz, their portion? It should say the object, right? Their portion should not be made into chametz. Shma min tarti. So you see that you can learn both halachot. First of all, that baking it is its own action, and for every individual action you're chayav. And the chelek of the Kohanim also cannot be chametz because the shirayim cannot be chametz. Says the Gemara, that's okay, but I have a whole nother way to look at that. The ema, maybe you should say, we are around 10 lines from the top of Daf Nun Hey Amud Bet, maybe afiyah, only the act of baking, the parit barachmana, that the Torah specified baking, the chayav chada, right? There you're chayav individually for baking a mincha that's chametz. But inuch, the other steps of the mincha, meaning the kneading it and the shaping it and the putting on the water, all of that, l'chayav chada kula. Maybe you're only chayav one for all of it. So maybe the Torah is saying, don't make this chametz. That's everything. And baking has its own separate chiyuv. But how do you know that every other maaseh yichidi also is chayav if it's done bit chametz? Answers the Gemara back to our beautiful principles that we have. Mishum dahavi davar shebechlal. Right, one of the midot shatar and dreshes b'hem is that if you have something that's included in a klal, and the klal here is don't make your mincha chametz. Yatsa min haklal, and it comes out, it's excluded. I mean, the Torah specifies this prat, this detail from the klal, which is don't bake it if it's chametz. Lilamed, and it comes to teach you, lo lilamed al atzmo yatsa. It doesn't just tell you this one halacha. Ela lamed al klal kulo yatsa. It goes back and teaches you about everything included in the general principle of don't make your mincha chametz. And then it said, don't bake it chametz. So just like baking it is its own act, any individual act is chayiv, and you can be chayiv three or four things if you do the whole thing bechametz. Okay, that's davar yotzei min haklal, lo lamed al atzmo yatsa, el lamed al klal kulo. Says the Gemara, well, maybe it's a klal prat. Ema lo te'aseh, right, is a klal. Don't make a mincha, chametz. That's everything. Then it says lo te'afeh. Don't bake your mincha with chametz. That's a prat. That's only saying a problem for baking. Kneading it's not a big deal. Who knows? Klal prat. Say a regular klal prat. Which remember what the rule about a klal prat is aim bichlal l'masha b'prat. Torah says don't do it in general. Don't do this one thing. You only limit the klal to that one thing. Aim bichlal l'masha b'prat. Maybe afia in midyachin alo. Forget about one isser, two issers. Maybe there's no isser whatsoever. Maybe the whole isser of don't make it chametz is only don't bake it bechametz. Amar Rabbi Aptoriki, says Rabbi Aptoriki, there's a reason that you can't say that. Because the psukim, if you recall, when it says lo ta'aseh chametz, it's in Parshat Vayikra, te'aseh. When it says lo te'afeh chametz, it's in Parshat Tzav. And mishum dahavi klal uprat amruchakim zemizeh. The klal and the prat are very far away from each other in the Torah. They're prucking away from each other. One's in the beginning of Vayikra, one's in the middle of Tzav. Kol prat, klal or prat amruchakim zemizeh. Anytime you have a klal and a prat that are far away from each other in geography in the Torah, ein daninotam mechlal prat. You don't learn a klal prat. Now, clearly they're referring to the same thing. They're both referring to carbon mincha. It's not the question. It's not that they're not relevant to each other. It's just that Torah is telling you don't do a klal prat because they're far away from each other. And so there's no klal prat. There is a davar shaya biklal, v'yatza min haklal, lo lamed al atzmo, lo lamed al klal kulo. And that's why we learn the way we learned. Okay, so that is the answer of Rav Aptoriki. Now, says the Gemara, we're around halfway down of Daf Nun Hey Amabet. Mativ Rav Ada bar Ava. Rav Ada bar Ava said, I have a big problem with what Rav Aptoriki just said. The Amri la Kidi. Some say it is Kidi. Remember, there's always a big argument about who is Kidi. Kidi literally means anyone, and so some people say it means we don't remember who it is, or we never knew who it was. Somebody else, an unnamed rabbi. Some say that Kidi was a person, that was actually someone's name. So either way, it's either Rav Ada bar Ava or Kidi. Asked the following question: is it really true what you just said, Rav Aptoriki? Uklal prat ruchakim zemizein daninotam beklal prat. Is it really true that when you have a klal prat that are different, that are far away from each other in the Torah, you can't learn a klal prat, right? But Tanya, but there's another braita, and this is a very interesting braita, a very seminal braita, and one that's going to take us into tomorrow's daf. So we're not going to finish it. But says the braita, there's a pasuk that says in the end of Vayikra, this is referring to the sa'ir of Hanasi, right? When the king does a chet, he brings a special sa'ir. So it's a sa'ir nasi. Pasuk says, shachat oto, shecht, the sa'ir nasi, b'makom asher yishchat hola, in the place where you shecht an ola, lifnei Hashem, in front of Hashem, chatatu. It's a chatat. Now, Heichen Ola Nishchatet, when the Torah says do it where you did the Ola, where's the Ola done? So everyone remembers the Mishnah in Zvachim, the Ezer Mekomon Shel Zvachim, B'tzafon. The Ola has to be done on the north side of the Azara. So this too, the Sa'ir Nasi, which is the Karban Chatat, the Torah says, Avzeh B'tzafon. This has to be done in the north. Okay, that's the Braita. Now ask the Braita, this is all the Braita speaking. Is that really the source that tells me that you have to do a karban, a sa'ir nasi in the north? Halok far nemar, the pasuk already said, and this is a pasuk actually later, that b'mekom asher yishachet hola tishachet achatat. It says in the pasuk that wherever you shech the ola, you should shech the chatas. So we already know it's later, but we know from later that a karban ola, that karban chatas is done in the same place as a karban ola, which means in the north, right? So the question is, so the question is, why do you need a separate pasuk to tell you that the Sa'ir Nasi needs to be done in the north? Says the Gemara, Aluk Varnem already said that, right? Lekov O, She'im Losh sorry, where I missed the place here. V'chi anu mikan lemeidim, right? Is this the source? V'alo kfar nemar b'makom asher tishachid olah tishachid chatat. So says the Gemara. So hala lama zeh yatsa. So why in the world does the Torah repeat or say by the Sa'ir Nasi that you do it in the north? Likovo. It's to tell you not only should you do it in the north, but you have to do it in the north. Shim lo shachat oto b'tzafon paslo. Remember, by kachim, just telling you should do something doesn't mean it's ma'akev. But this is telling you that you must do it in the north. Not only should you shech your chatas where you shech the olah, you have to do it. Now, it continues the Braita, right? Braita continues. Ata omer lekach yatsa. You say that is this the purpose of saying by a Sa'ir Nasi that it should be done like an Ola? O Eino Ella, maybe what it's coming to tell you is Shezet to'un safon ve'inachar to'un safon. The same question, right? You have basically a pasuk in Tzav which says every chatas should be shechted where an Ola is shechted. So I would think a chatas has to be done in the north. Then you have a pasuk that says that the Sa'ir Nasi should be done in the north. Maybe it's coming to tell you that only the Sa'ir Nasi, only this carbon needs to be done in the north, but other carbonot chatat don't need to be done in the north, right? So therefore, Talmud Omer, therefore the Torah says, this is a third pasuk, V'shachat et chatat b'makom asher tishchat et olah. You should shech the chatat. This is the pasuk we're referring to now is in Vayikra again. You should shech. Sorry, this is the pasuk that we quoted. This pasuk is back in Vayikra. You shech the chatat where you shechted the olah. Ze banaav the chol chataot shetunot safon. This is how we know that every karban chatat needs to be in the north. Okay, so now that's the end of the Braita. So it says north by Sa'ir Nasi, but we said that's not enough. Because we asked, why does it say north by Sa'ir Nasi? It says north by all chataot. And we said it's to tell you that it's ma'akev. It says, why do you need that? Maybe it's there to tell you that only a Sa'ir Nasi needs to be done in the north. We have a third pasuk that says every chatat should be done like an ola. Okay? Now says the Gemara, what this Braita is teaching us, and this is Rav Ada bar Ava, or Kadi's question, Taima dekatav rachmana v'shachara chatat, right? The only reason that you can actually say that every chatat needs to be done in the north is because you have a third pasuk that says you should do the chatat, right? But if you didn't, halav hachi, if you didn't have this third pasuk, I would have thought, we are at the eighth or so last of the narrow lines, time to go to Rachmana v'shacharet chatat. Halav hachi, if you didn't have the third pasuk, hava mina, I would have thought to say, shezet to'un safon, v'ein achar to'un safon. I would have thought to say that the Sa'ir Nasi needs to be done in the north, and it's the only one, because the Torah said, all chatot to be done like an ola. And then it said the Sa'ir Nasi is done like the ola. I would have walked away from that if I just had those two psukim and said, only the Sa'ir Nasi is done in the north. Every chatat is not included. The Torah said every chatat. It meant this chatat. But why don't you say it's a klal prat, right? Why don't you say, why would you say that? Mishum dahavid klal prat. Because remember, there's two rules that we started with. One is a klal prat, where you have a rule and then a prat. And then we say, ein mechlal mashab prat. The rule here would be a chatat is done like an ola. The prat is a Sa'ir Nasi is done like an ola, and that's the only thing included in the rule, right? That's one concept. But we don't say that. I mean, we do say that. The problem with that is that we said earlier that by baking the mincha as chametz, we wouldn't say a klal prat because they're far away from each other. But these two are far away from each other. Well, the pasuk of Sa'ir Nasi is in Vayikra. The pasuk of Chatat and Ola is in Tzav. So it says more clearly here, without the third pasuk, we would have had a klal prat. Even though they are in different parshiot, right? They still, it seems like the Tana of the Braita has no problem done in oto b'klal prat, right? So therefore, the Tana has no problem saying it's a klal prat, even though one is in Vayikra and one is in Tzav. Says Rav Papa, that's not a question. Rashi, sorry. Not for Rashi. Says Rashi to Rav Ada bar Ava. You're making a big mistake. This is not a klal prat. A klal prat means you have a rule and then you have a specific. But here it's the opposite. First, the Torah talks about the Sa'ir Nasi in Vayikra. Then it talks about the general thing in Tzav. So this is not a prat, a klal prat, where you talk about general and then a prat. I klal pratu klalu. This is the opposite. This is where the Torah says the Sa'ir Nasi has to be shechted in the north. And then the Torah says every chatat is shechted in the north, which is a prat and then a klal. And the principle is, Naseh klal mosif ala prat. Usually, when you do it that way, if the Torah first says the prat and then you have a klal, you actually include more things. V'drabi lu kol mili, and you say everything, right? So it doesn't make sense. The reason the Tana said you needed a third pasuk cannot be because we would have thought to have a klal of prat. So why did the Tana say you had to have a third pasuk? Elatana otoka kashale. The problem of the Tana was not because it said do all carbonot as a klal, do the Sayir Nasi as a prat, and I would have thought the prat limits everything. It's because it says do it, make it specifically. Hachikamar, I might have thought that because it says it is done in the north, it meaning the Sayir Nasi, maybe Oeno Elish Zet un Safon ve'ein achar tun Safon dikatav Rachmana Oto. Because the Torah specifically says shecht it in the north, which made me think nothing else is done in the north. And therefore we needed to have a third pasuk to say every karban chatat is done in the north. So ask the Gemara at the end of today's daf. The hashta, the first of the wide lines. The nafkale mivishachat et chatat oto limute mai. So it turns out that shachat chatat tells you every chatat is done in the north. So why did the Torah say shecht this sa'ir nasi in the north? Answers the Gemara limute. I think we're going to stop here. So the question is at 4 lines from the bottom, why in the world does it say by specifically the sa'ir nasi that it should be shechted in the north when it turns out every karban chatat is shechted in the north? What are you teaching me? And tomorrow, God willing, which will hopefully be Sunday, we will start 3 lines from the bottom and understand why it says oto by the chatat of the sa'ir nasi, and what it teaches you that I wouldn't have known from every other karban chatat. So hopefully this was clear, and hopefully we will learn in person tomorrow morning on Sunday morning at 7:45 a.m. Eastern Time, which will be 4:45 a.m. Pacific Time for those following from home. Hope everyone is doing well. Shavua Tov.